Imagine having access to a tribe of mentors consisting of some of the best tech leaders in the world, people you may have never heard of, but who in just an hour, you'll know their unfiltered career story. The bets they took, the decisions they made, where they failed, and the lessons that they learned along the way. Welcome to the What Makes You Tick podcast. Hello, I'm Tolu, aka the Podfather, and I'm the host of the What Makes You Tick podcast.
And I'm Richard Washington. I'm the MD of Tick Talent, and we sponsor this pod.
So this week's episode is with Chris Muir. What did you think of the episode listening back?
Yeah, loved this episode. Chris is someone who I hadn't met before, but instantly liked because he's just so honest. And I think that most people that work in tech, if it hasn't already happened, it's like part of the territory that you will face things that are outside your control. So in Chris's instance, he's faced a couple of redundancies, right? And his reaction to that was incredible. I know that there was a part that really resonated to you based on him basically turning a redundancy into an opportunity to go and write a book, right?
That was amazing for me. That was his response, was this thing that's sucky's happened, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to produce something that's going to help other people. That was amazing for me.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll put a link in the comments for people that they can get that on Kindle, because it sounds like an incredible sales book for anyone to read. And he's also someone who is really into self-development, but not like for this massive pursuit of greatness, often because he loves developing people and he loves systemizing that. So he's brought that into a few of the businesses that he's worked at, and he's worked for big businesses like NetSuite, and now he's in a smaller startup within that group as well. So someone who's built relationships that have helped him through his career, and then he's used all of that knowledge and everything that he's learned to help the next generation of talent. And he's got some really interesting perspectives on what he looks for when he's hiring teams as well, which I think people will enjoy. So without further ado, tick, tick, boom, let's roll the pod.
Chris, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, me too. When we had our pre-chat, I think there was a lot of interesting bits and tidbits that kind of came up. So I'm really looking forward to getting a bit more into that. Would you mind explaining a little bit about who you are, where you work, a little bit about your company?
Sure. I'm from Scotland originally, from Glasgow, brought up in the west coast of Scotland, and we'll get into the kind of journey that got me here. But I've been in sales for 25 plus years in various roles in various technologies, various industries, different size companies. I currently work for a company called ProScope for NetSuite. We're a partner of NetSuite, which is part of Oracle. We provide advanced project management software capabilities for kind of complex industries, construction, oil and gas, renewables, those types of things.
That's awesome. And how long have you been at this company for?
Only since the end of January, actually, although I've worked with them and known them for about 4 years, because I was at NetSuite for 5.5, 6 years, and we worked closely with ProScope as part of my team. So I've known them for quite a long time.
That's awesome. And what is it that you enjoy the most about your current role?
Developing people is the thing that I get the most satisfaction out of. Now, it wasn't always like that, but as I've developed and progressed in my management and leadership career, that's the thing that really kind of motivates me and has made me, when I've made changes in my career more recently, it's usually been because I've felt that I wanted to expand that or do that a little bit differently. My own personal development is something I take very seriously, and I think, and especially in this day and age, it's a critical component to employee satisfaction and retention. So it's something I get a lot of pleasure out of.
And you said it was something that happened a bit further into your career. Was there a catalyst or a defining moment that really encouraged you in this direction?
Possibly. I think not long after I moved to London in 2002, I got involved in coaching young people's football.
Okay.
And I think that opened up an interest from my perspective in seeing how people could learn and develop. We had 650 kids, so it was quite a big experience. And I was responsible for the technical development of the players. And I soon learned that I didn't really care whether the teams won or lost. It didn't really matter to me. What really mattered to me was, one, whether people were having fun, because it has to be that. And that's a little bit different from business sometimes, but not completely removed. But also the individuals were developing, because And I think that taught me that people develop in different ways and people develop at different speeds. It probably opened up a passion that I hadn't really realized was there before that.
Okay, that's cool. So I wanted to hear a bit more about your journey from what you studied all the way through to your current role at ProScope.
Interestingly, I didn't study, at least in the university sense of study. I didn't go to university. I because of the way I was raised and the background I came from, I wasn't encouraged to go to university, at least by my family. My teachers were encouraging me to go to university because I did reasonably well at school, but left school at the age of 17 with decent qualifications, but really not sure what I was going to do. Had my eye on a job that was very different from what I'm doing now. Actually, it was essentially designing aeroplanes for a company in Scotland.
Wow, that is very different.
Yeah, exactly. And British Aerospace was a company who had a facility close to where I lived. And I was one of the key aspects of the requirements for that role was to have a higher or A-level technical drawing qualification. And I was the only person in Scotland in my year to have that qualification. So I pretty much thought I was a shoo-in for the job. It was like, it's my job, I'm going to get it. And at the last minute, another kid from my school whose dad worked for the place got offered the job, which was somewhat crushing, taught me quite a lot about expectations, managing expectations, and it set me back a little bit. I actually then started working in the shop that my dad ran. It was a dry cleaning chain of shops that he was managing, and I worked in that for 6 months just because I needed to get my head together and think about what I was going to do. And I then jumped around a little bit for the next 2 or 3 years. I did window cleaning. I had a business cleaning carpets. I worked in an ice rink for a bit. I did a bit of DJing. I did quite a lot of stuff through my sort of late teens into my early 20s, and got to a point where I thought I needed to settle down. I needed to get a job. This would have been, 92 maybe, something like that, and was struggling to find a place, to be honest, because I didn't really have anything that I could hold on to and say, here's my experience. I didn't really have anything. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have it, so I couldn't go into grad programs or any of that sort of stuff. And I ended up applying for a job at an electronic subcontractor. They were making Commodore 64s, ZX Spectrums. If you've heard of them, you're too young to have used those. But that's what they were making. And so they were making those in the west coast of Scotland, and they always hired seasonal staff leading up to the Christmas period because obviously those kind of products were quite popular at Christmas. So I applied for a job actually working on the factory floor, putting little connectors into printed circuit boards. Got the job. On the induction day, we were in a room and some guy stuck his head round the door and said, I need 2 people to work in the warehouse. And instantly in my head, that appealed to me more than working on a manufacturing floor. So I immediately stuck my hand up. So got taken there, did an induction there, was given the autonomy, I think, to start looking at changing some stuff, which is quite unusual. So our main job was receiving materials, sorting it all out, and then putting it on in batches onto the production floor so they could make whatever they had to make. So I came up with some processes that simplified that and made it a little bit easier. That got me noticed. The guy who ran that department went to another company. He headhunted me and took me with him to work in their materials department and do materials planning and those types of things. I then got a move into procurement, so worked as a buyer in that company. And it was in that role, that my then manager, who sadly is no longer with us, came to me one day and said, I think you'd be really good in sales. I've lined up 2 interviews for you with 2 of our suppliers. Are you interested?
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, wow, that was exactly my reaction. And I was kind of between, is that a good thing or are you trying to get rid of me?
What's
going on here? But I built some really good relationships with some of the suppliers. I think he spotted that their working conditions, the fact that they were traveling, that they were visiting different people, that they had a company car, all of those types of things appealed to me. I thought, and I wasn't vocal about it, but I talked about it. So I went for the 2 interviews and subsequently joined TDK, who are a very well-known Japanese company. It was my first proper job in sales. And from there, that was what I would class as commodity sales. So it was selling things that 5 other companies did exactly the same. So it was all about relationships. It was all about to some extent price, which is never a good thing if you're in sales. It was all about quality, but predominantly building relationships, which I have always been very good at. Despite considering myself a little bit of an introvert, or more introvert than extrovert, I've always been really good at building relationships. And worked there for, I think it was about 4.5, 5 years, moved to a company that did something very similar, worked there for about 6 years, and then moved into a different sector within the electronics technology industry that facilitated my move to London. Interestingly, in all that time since then, so I guess I applied for and interviewed for the job at SCI when I was 22. Every job I've ever had since then, I've been headhunted or approached about rather than applied for.
Wow.
Was
there anything common that came up as to why people were consistently looking for you?
I don't think so, actually. I think in some cases it was because it was people that I'd worked with and they had moved on. So that applied in a couple of instances. And I think if you look at the role I'm in now, that's exactly what's happened, right? I worked with these guys for 2 or 3 years when I was at NetSuite. They knew that I was available, so that kind of came up. I think it's the only common thing is building connections and maintaining those connections, as well as making sure that you don't burn any bridges when you move from one role to another. Or actually, when someone else moves from a role to somewhere else, it might mean change for you, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't maintain that connection and keep that going. So that I worked in electronics through to 2015, I think, 14, 15. And I got to a point, and that period included actually the first time I'd ever been made redundant from a company because unfortunately the company wasn't successful, which was a pretty tough thing to experience and taught me quite a lot about how forthright I should have been in my beliefs about some of the things that the company were doing and how we were going to market and what we were doing around some of the product stuff, because I think we could have saved that. And interestingly, when I was having a conversation with the chairman about a role, he asked me some of the best interview questions I've ever been asked. And one of the questions he asked me was, what has been your biggest failure? And that was my biggest failure, that not standing up for what I believed in that role, not believing that I had a loud enough voice to actually facilitate change, which ultimately meant we lost a customer, which meant the company didn't survive.
So were you in a leadership role there or as part of the team?
Yeah, I was global sales director.
Right.
Now, I had a team of 2 or 3. It wasn't, so I was doing a lot of the work myself. It was what I describe as a player manager role. But I was in the senior leadership team. I was presenting at board level every second or third board meeting. So retrospectively thinking about it, I absolutely should have felt comfortable and confident to stick my hand up and say, I don't think this is the right strategy. You learn from these things and you move on. But one of the things that then started to make me think was, I don't know if I want to be in electronics anymore. It was a really interesting industry, partly because it gave me lots to talk about. I worked with Apple when they were developing the iPhone, for example. I worked with Dyson when they were developing the hand dryer that you see in a lot of public toilet facilities. I worked with Sky when they were developing or starting to talk about developing Sky Q. So lots of really interesting things that you could talk about when someone said, what do you do? It's really cool. So that was really good. But the electronics industry in the UK and Europe generally has been diminishing as more and more of the manufacturing has moved to other parts of the world. And the senior roles were becoming smaller, or the availability of them was becoming smaller and smaller. So I consciously thought, where do I want to go? Where do I think makes sense? And software became the obvious focal point, I think. I have a really good friend who was working at NetSuite and now runs NetSuite in EMEA. And I'd been talking to her a lot about what she was doing and what her kind of career path was. She was an account executive being pushed into management. She wasn't sure she wanted to do it. So we were talking about that, and I was talking about kind of getting into software. She didn't think I was ready. Interestingly, she didn't think I quite had what it took to manage the kind of rigors of working in the software industry. So I consciously took a role with a company that make the body-worn video cameras that the police use and wear, and you see them now in retail outlets as well. And that kind of was a bridge between the kind of electronic technology, because there was still a physical item, and a software need. So it gave me a bit of an introduction into what that might mean. I did that for 18 months, and that was enough to convince my friend to introduce me to her then boss. And he and I hit it off. I got the role at NetSuite and worked there for 5.5 years, ultimately running 3 sales teams before I moved on into other roles and eventually the role I'm at the moment.
So how did you find that transition? Did you think it was as hard as she thought it would be, or did you find it quite easy?
I found it exceptionally easy, actually. I think, and I've spoken to her about it since, and I spoke to other people in the business, and software companies generally are quite resistant to look at people from outside of the software world. They think NetSuite's an ERP product. There are lots of people within NetSuite that will never hire anyone that hasn't got ERP experience, because they think there's some sort of black magic secret sauce, something. That my approach actually was to go the complete opposite way. I went out deliberately out to find people that hadn't come from that background, because I saw in myself that I could take transferable skills from other roles that were completely different into that role. And I'll plug my book, if you don't mind, called A Winning Strategy, and it encapsulates everything I used to do in the electronics industry in terms of how to develop new business, and took it into the software business, and actually significantly changed the performance of my team in some pretty key areas. And it had the same impact for me when I was a salesperson, doing the exact same things, but just applying them differently because of the industry was different.
So tell me a bit more about the book. So what made you decide to write it? When did you write it? What's happening with it now?
So I experienced my second redundancy in October last year.
Okay.
I had joined a startup software construction company, and I think probably the second biggest mistake I've made in my career, in that I didn't do I didn't do the right level of due diligence on the people at the company, not the company themselves, because I did that, but I didn't do the right level of due diligence on the people, and it didn't work out.
Sorry,
so I had.
What do you mean by that? That's really interesting for me in terms of the due diligence on the people.
Yeah, I hadn't studied their backgrounds sufficiently and to understand if I thought they were the right people to run that kind of business, and therefore, and also work with me in terms of characteristics. The process in terms of me being approached and then ultimately joining the company was rushed because they were desperate to get someone in. I think that I looked at the investment they had, I looked at who the investors were. So I did all of that kind of due diligence I talked about, and asked questions about what their cash burn was and those types of things. But I didn't actually sit down and really look at the CRO and what his background was, and whether I felt he was the right person to work with, do what I thought was necessary, and some other key people in the business. So anyway, it didn't work out, which is a shame because the product itself was really good. But so I had 3 months garden leave from October to January, and I decided to treat my job search as a job, which I think a lot of people are starting to do if they're in that kind of position, but also really focused myself on getting up at the same time pretty much most mornings, coming into the office that I've got here at home, sitting at my desk, doing stuff that was work related. Some of that was educating myself in certain areas and doing some different development stuff. But I introduced this concept of win strategizing at NetSuite with my team, and I always felt that it was something that as a methodology that could be used across lots of new business functions. The tagline for the book is account planning for the new business world, right? Account managers, when they've got a book of accounts and they're trying to sell additional products or additional functionality or whatever into them, they've got a very prescribed approach that they will go through to understand that business, identify the key stakeholders, all of those types of things. And essentially all I did was took all of that and applied it to a logic that would work in an environment where you've never spoken to the company before, you don't really know what they do, you don't know what they're looking for, and it pulls in elements of other sales methodologies, right? I think Challenger is a great sales methodology. I think the whole concept around value selling is something that is really key in a lot of industries, and we use it extensively today. And I actually dedicate some time in the book to my kind of theory around value selling, because I think it's quite different to some other people's. So I had this idea in my head, and I had, at the start of the pandemic, I had started writing a book about golf travel,
Okay.
I run a golf trip to Scotland with some friends every year, and I was actually going into hospital for a relatively minor operation and took my iPad with me and started writing this book while I was waiting to be taken down for the operation. So I got into the mindset of getting stuff down on paper. And I thought, I'm on garden leave. Of course, I'm trying to find a job. I'm doing interviews. I'm doing other stuff. Let's see what happens. So I started writing it one day, and within 4 days, I'd written the book, basically.
4 days?
Yeah, 4 days. It took me 4 days to write it.
That is impressive.
Not 4 days back to back, but
Yeah.
over a 2-week period, I spent 4 days writing it. And I sat on it for a bit. I sent it to a couple of people to read and get some feedback on it. It's a pretty short book. It's only about 12,000 words, because most sales books spend about a third of their time justifying why you should read the book. Then they have a third of the book that tells you what you want to know, and then they've got a third that tries to sell you something. I've cut out the beginning bit and the end bit and just got into the bit that's really interesting. Right? Of course, there's a little bit about background in terms of why I've done it and where it came from, but I'm not trying to sell anything other than a book, obviously. So yeah, then I sat on it for a bit, thought, what will I do about it? And I thought, well, let's try and self-publish it on Kindle, see what that looks like. So I got someone to proofread it, designed a cover for it myself, and then put it up on Kindle. And I couldn't actually tell you how many. I think I have sold some, but I've got no idea how many I've sold because I haven't actually really looked. What will happen with it, I don't know. I'm a member of the Institute of Sales Professionals, which is a kind of sort of body that I would actually recommend anyone in sales considers joining. It's not expensive to join on an annual basis. They've got some really good content that they deliver through webinars, and they actually, as part of their e-magazine every quarter, have a book review section. So they put me in touch with a publisher to see if there's any interest in it being published. So that may or may not happen. I don't know yet.
It's an amazing achievement, firstly, to start a book, because a lot of people won't actually take that step, but then to actually finish it and put it out there, it's an amazing achievement. So well done on that. And I really hope that more people get to see it. It's impressive.
Personally, I'm much more interested in the golf book, but which is still a work in progress. And I'm actually getting to the point where it's too long, so I'm going to have to turn it into different volumes, but I haven't, which means I can publish the first volume, but I need to find an ending to that first volume, which I just haven't got around to doing yet. But it's much more of an interest from a passion perspective for me. The exciting thing about the whole theory behind the book is that it produced significant results. At NetSuite with my team, it drove up our win rates, it drove up our average deal size, it reduced our average discount level. So all of those key, not all, but some of the key metrics that indicate success, they don't mean success, but indicate success, were trending in the right way because we were starting to use this kind of process and methodology.
And how did you find it? Like, is it something you came up with, you sat and you planned through, or was it kind of bits of different things that you put together?
Yeah, I think the latter, totally. I think over the years, I'd taken different bits from different roles I had. If I refer back to the first sales role I had, which was much more about building relationships, so I had to know the key people, I had to understand what was coming down the pipeline for those guys and make sure I was positioned properly. I think I've always believed that a good salesperson intimately understands their customer or their target customer, and therefore one of the key aspects of the theory is do that level of research that you might not otherwise have done, understand what makes them tick as a business and individuals. But then there's a key element to it, which is I've always believed is absolutely crucial to successful salespeople, and that's the ability to know when to say no or to walk away from something because you don't believe that you can be successful. And I think in a world, and it happens a lot in software sales, where there's high churns of people and you've always got new people who are desperate to do their first deal or desperate to do their second deal, you can often get into a mindset that you've got to chase after absolutely everything, and that's definitely not the case. So that was something that I learned very early on in my career, that there are times when you just can't deliver what you need to deliver to win a deal, and you've just got to accept that and move on to the next one. And the earlier you can do that in a sales cycle, the less costly it is to your business. So again, you can drive up the right metrics. So I think just back to your earlier point, it was just a culmination of a lot of things I've learned over the years from lots of different people that I've worked with and for. and just it almost became the perfect opportunity for me to take all of that stuff and put it into one methodology that worked with my team at that point in time.
That makes sense. That makes sense. One of the things that you mentioned is about what makes people tick, which is basically the name of this podcast. So what would you say makes you tick as a sales leader?
So there's a really interesting kind of backstory to this answer. So when I got made redundant, a coach reached out to me on LinkedIn. And it wasn't really, he didn't know I'd been made redundant. He just reached out to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast and in the world gets hundreds of LinkedIn messages like I do on a weekly basis. So this one hit my inbox, and there was something about it that intrigued me or piqued my attention, but I'd just been made redundant. So I wasn't really in a position to go spending a load of money on a coach, despite me actually thinking at that point in time it probably would have been quite a good thing to do. So I responded to him, and I basically said, look, I like the idea of what you're talking about, but I've just been made redundant. I'm not going to commit to spending money on something until I kind of know where I'm going. And he said, look, I'd love to give you a free 1.5 hour session with me.
Wow.
Which I did. And the single biggest thing that he did in that session was he allowed me to tell him what I thought made me tick, and then he articulated it in a way that made absolute sense.
Wow.
And in terms of my then approach to talking to people in interview situations or in casual chat situations about what I might bring to a role or why I might want to do a role, I had this playbook of 4 or 5 things that I could just refer to because it's given me that, and it was absolutely brilliant. So the core elements of that were, I said it right up front, right? Personal development, whether it's my personal development or the people that work with me and for me, that's a core principle of everything I've done. And again, that a management and leadership level, that really started at NetSuite because I enhanced my own personal development and navigated the internal Oracle systems, which were pretty difficult to navigate at the time, and rolled that out to my team and made it a core requirement of their objectives, that they all had a personal development plan, that that personal development plan was reviewed on a quarterly basis, that it was aligned to core objectives and core competencies, if you want to put it like that. And I took that, I designed a program for one of our kind of, you might call them an inside sales team at NetSuite. So I designed a development program for them to be ready for other roles in the business. So I designed the program, project managed it, implemented it, and then passed it off to the training team, which I got a huge amount of. And I did that. The reason I did that was because I was, at that point in time, I was doing an apprenticeship in leadership with the Chartered Management Institute. And one of the requirements was to run a project to your business that wasn't related to your everyday job. I was fortunate enough that Oracle and NetSuite let me do that. But I got a huge amount out of that, seeing how that worked and how it ticked, and making adjustments to it, learning from the first cohort had some challenges, so we reviewed it and looked at how we could adjust the program for the next cohort, etc. Even where I am now, all of my team have 4 objectives. The 4th objective is always personal development. That remains, regardless of what the other 3 are. There's always a core and personal development objective. I really get a lot of pleasure out of seeing other people be successful, and that I'm more than happy to take a back seat and let someone else take the credit for winning a deal. I love that, especially if it's somebody that's worked for me or working for me, because I will get reflected credit for it, right? But one of the benefits that gives me, sales can be quite emotional. You get highs and lows, right? You get the euphoria of winning a big deal. You get the absolute despondency of losing a deal that you thought you were absolutely a shoe-in to win. And one of the things I bring to the table is I kind of level set that, because I'm taking a back seat. I get a lot of benefit or a lot of enjoyment out of just trying to sometimes bring them down from the high because they need to be brought down because that's not sustainable, but also building them up when things haven't gone quite right. Of course, we focus on the numbers because we have to deliver a number that we're in sales. You can't avoid that, but trying to take some of the emotion out of it as much as possible. Sometimes it's not possible. I had a really difficult forecast call last week because something hit me out of nowhere that I wasn't expecting, and you, even in those situations, find it difficult not to react. So those are 2 key elements. The third thing that I think is really important to me is I like to be involved in lots of different things. I believe, and I've believed for a long time, that I have a capacity to add value outside of just the sales function or the sales and marketing function. And I think part of the reason why a lot of times I've worked for smaller companies or companies that are growing into a new market or are just finding their feet is because that ability to get involved in different things and give an opinion and help out and get your hands dirty, if you want to use that expression, is something that I really enjoy. And being a big part of the reason why I ultimately left Oracle NetSuite was because I'd got to a point where that had stopped. I was really only focused on being a sales leader. There wasn't any other stuff on the outside. And in my current role, I sit on the board, I'm in the senior leadership meetings, talking about the other aspects of the business and being involved in those kind of decisions. And that's something that I really enjoy. I get a lot out of.
That makes sense. And so you mentioned about the apprentice in leadership and that being part of your personal development. What motivated you to start doing that?
So it came about, Oracle acquired NetSuite late in 2016, so I'd only been there a couple of months. And as you can imagine, when that sort of things happens, there's a lot of concern from people about what's going to happen. Are they going to get rid of all of us? Are they going to completely change how we operate, et cetera, et cetera? I'd worked for companies that had been acquired. I'd worked for companies that had acquired other companies. So I was quite relaxed about it and trying to help people understand, one, that there's not really much you can do, but to just run with it and see what happens. And one of the things that I appreciated really early on was that Oracle have a massive amount of access to learning development. They have what they call the Oracle University, so they pull content in from LinkedIn Learning, Harvard, it was lynda.com at the time, now LinkedIn Learning, Harvard Business Review, O'Reilly's. They commission independent companies to run training courses. They make available a huge amount of collateral to their employees. And I figured one day that I was now in a proper management position. So most of my positions prior to the NetSuite position had been more player manager or partner manager. So they were manager roles, and I was managing some people, but not a role where I was only now managing. And Oracle NetSuite was the first time I'd done that. I didn't have any responsibility directly for customers or prospects, but I only had responsibility for a team. And it suddenly struck me that I'd never had any formal education around being a manager. It just never happened. In the same way that lots of people don't have any formal training around sales, around being a salesperson. And actually the introduction to the book is actually me talking about that and talking about the percentage of the population that would classify themselves as salespeople and how few of them have actually gone through a formal training to be a salesperson or professional training. So I started looking around within the Oracle catalogue of collateral to see what was there, and there was a couple of training courses that they delivered or they had people deliver. So I did them, enjoyed them, right? Started to get an enjoyment out of doing that personal development, and then was looking for something else to do. And because the HR team knew that I was interested in this and was pushing this for my team, they were talking to a provider about running a kind of diploma, senior advanced diploma level, so just one level below degree leadership and management course with the Chartered Management Institute accreditation. And they asked me if I wanted to go on it, and I said yes. So I thought, yeah, I'll do that. And it was interesting because, as I said earlier, I didn't go to university, so I'd never gone through the kind of formal writing that is required in writing dissertations or writing up the stuff that you have to, and doing proper Harvard referencing and all that kind of stuff. So I had to learn all that. So I was learning about being a better leader, but I was also learning about how to do that stuff as well. And it was kind of interesting, but it was a hugely useful exercise for me to do. It tied up a lot of what I had learned and believed and did with a theoretical background, which meant that I could talk about stuff in a different way. It taught me some stuff that I hadn't really thought about, and some pretty critical stuff in terms of how I do my job and how I got my team to do their jobs. So it was great experience.
So as we're talking about leadership, You briefly mentioned your manager who encouraged you into sales. I wanted to know who is
Yes.
the best leader that you've ever had, and what were some of the things that you took from them?
A good question. I don't think I had one best leader or manager. I think there's probably three in my career who have influenced different parts of what I am now.
You can talk about all three.
Yeah, no. So that one was the first in starting because he, at a very early age, taught me that I had a place and that I should seek out what I wanted to do. And he was such a relaxed manager. He, at a time, again, we're talking about the early 90s, right? So mid 90s, maybe. Yeah, maybe just mid to early 90s. At that point in time, I would say he was quite an enlightened leader because at that point in time, a lot of leaders were very autocratic and told you what to do. He was very much not like that. He was someone that was much more consultative, much more democratic in his approach. And that, I think, that was something that I appreciated and learned a lot from. And I think that's informed my leadership style a lot since then. In the next role that I had, I worked for a manager who just gave me a freedom to go off and express myself that I probably shouldn't have had at the stage I was at in my career. I'm not sure why he did that. Maybe he didn't want to spend time. I don't know, but that really played a big part in my early sales career in terms of setting my approach to how I did things, and not necessarily from a leadership perspective, actually, just from a sales perspective. Allowed me to go and find out things for myself, and supported me when things didn't go quite as well as they might have done. Because I always think it's interesting when I say salespeople say I've smashed my number every year. I definitely did not smash my number every year. I had bad years. I had years where I might have been on an informal performance improvement plan. I think that all of those things happened to me in my career. And unfortunately, when things weren't going as well as they might have been, the managers that helped me through that were the ones that I tend to remember the most. And then the third manager I had was the manager I had when I moved from Scotland to down to London. And I think that, again, he was very similar in that he just gave you a framework to work in and then allowed you the latitude to go and do it, and then got involved when you needed to and gave you guidance. And I think all three of those managers, if you think back to the first one who came to me and said, you should be in sales, actually every one of those managers, before I got to the point of moving out of their companies, I was talking to them about what my aspirations were and having a conversation about whether I could do that within the business that I was in. And in all cases, we came to the conclusion that I probably needed to move on to do what I wanted to do at that time, but I had the relationship and confidence to have that discussion with them. And that, for me, stood out with all three of them because I felt comfortable enough to have that conversation.
Wow. I think that's absolutely amazing because sometimes managers are quite scared of people leaving, and it's almost it can be taken personally when someone leaves. But to almost like proactively encourage someone away from the company because it's the right thing to do for their career, that's honestly, it's such a rare thing. And you've had three managers that have all been willing to do that. That's amazing.
Yeah. I think there's an element of it comes from my own personality as well, and believing that I should be able to have that conversation and it shouldn't impact anything. But there's lots of anecdotes that get thrown about that people leave. They don't leave a company; they leave their manager.
Yeah,
I
leave bad
fundamentally
manager,
don't. I really don't. That I do not prescribe to that. There are occasions when it does happen. Of course, there are, but invariably there's other reasons, and it very often is because of people's desire to develop and progress, and that not being available to them. And that's certainly been my experience. Some people will go for money, fine. Some people will go because they might get a shinier new car, or working conditions might be different. But I think even more and more in this day and age, and with the generation that is coming into the working environment now, they are so focused on what development and progression looks like for them that you have to be aware of it. You have to, I think you have to be having those conversations with people. And if someone comes to me and says, look, I want to do X in 2 years' time, my immediate response will be, okay, how do we help you get there? What do we need to do from a development perspective to help you get there? But if we don't have that role, you will absolutely go with my blessing, because if you do that, those people will always remember that and might come back in a stronger position at some point in the future.
And I think it's that longer term thinking that's so important, because this isn't the end. You've been headhunted later by people that you've worked with in different scenarios. So all of these things build towards that bigger picture.
Yeah, maybe a couple of things that I'd like to share that talk about this to some extent. One of the core things that you might call it a light bulb moment when I was going through the apprenticeship, was a realization that actually the best way to present to people is by thinking about what you would like to see if you were sitting in the audience. And the way that we sell, a lot of sales pitches and presentations will start off with 4 or 5 slides about the company and about the individuals, and I looked at that and thought, that doesn't make sense, because they don't want to know about us. They've invited us in, so they've already done enough due diligence to get to that point. They don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about them. So that was a bit of a light bulb moment in terms of how we work with our potential customers. But then it was also a light bulb moment for me in terms of how I presented and worked with my team. And it made me realize that if I wanted them to do something, I had to think about what the benefit to them was and present it in that way. So when I introduced the idea, or when I wanted to introduce the idea of them all doing development plans and actually carrying through on those development plans, I introduced it by saying to them, imagine you're sitting in an interview and the person who's interviewing you has got your CV, which tells you what roles you've done, and you might have put a little bit of information on it, who knows. Imagine while they're doing that, you can then hand them your development plan and show them all the things that you've done behind each of those roles to show your progression. Do you think that would make you stand out as a candidate?
Yeah.
And every one of them, now that wasn't an original idea from me, by the way, I heard that from someone else, but I thought that's a great way to present that in terms of how am I going to get these guys to realize that this is a good thing for them to do? And I said to them, whether that's another internal role or an external role, I don't care. I want you to be in as strong a position as you possibly can be. And every one of them immediately said, yeah, let's go into it, and worked on it and did that for the rest of the time. Either they were in the business or I was in the business. And a couple of them subsequently have told me that has helped them secure new roles, which is great. It's perfect.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Something I was just thinking as you were saying that was, if you were hiring somebody, what firstly would you be looking for? But then how would you, in that kind of same way, how would you sell the benefits of them to come and work for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I look for character. I think that's the most important thing. I'm a little bit old school, although I'm changing my mentality around this because I have to, in terms of I tend to look for people that have had a reasonable tenure with businesses. I'm recruiting for a couple of roles right now, and if I see someone that's jumped around every year, that would immediately put me off. So those would be qualifying questions, if you want to put it that way, before we get to conversation. And I typically recruit for sales roles. So there's 3 things that I look for in a salesperson or a sales manager. Curiosity, so a desire to find out more. And that might be more about the company they're talking to, the people, the problems they've got. It could be finding out more about our own business or the people in our business. So that's number 1. Pessimism, which is a strange one.
Yeah, not heard that before.
But I think, I genuinely believe that good salespeople are pessimistic. And by that, they don't always believe what they're told. And again, they ask an extra couple of questions to clarify and confirm what they're being told. And it also means that when it comes to the kind of the requirements of a sales role, with things like forecasting and pipeline management, they will tend to be a little bit more realistic and under promise over deliver, which is a great position to be in. As long as they're delivering enough, it's a great position to be in. And
so how do you identify that pessimism when you're having an interview with someone?
It's very direct questions around how they might have managed the sales situation with someone, and I would tie it to metrics like forecast accuracy. It saddens me a little bit and I always get attracted to CVs when I see people produce metrics on a CV, because I think that's someone who's understands what they do and how they do it. I could tell you my forecast accuracy for every job I've ever had. from my first sales job. And I know that's a bit weird and a bit kind of geeky, but
I'm a
but
data
that's
guy,
just,
so that's great.
yeah, that's just the way I work. And I don't expect everyone to do that, but I would expect someone to be able to say to me, I'm about 70-80% or whatever it is. Though there's a bunch of questions that I'll ask round about that. There's a bunch of questions that I'll ask round about. Typically, I'd ask someone to pick a sales cycle that they've gone through and present that to me and talk me through how they did it. And I would use that to then drill down into questions. And the third characteristic is coachability, which is fairly common for a lot of people. And that's where the development plan piece comes in, because you evidence that by saying, okay, tell me what you've done. Tell me, show me and talk to me about what you've done over the last 2 or 3 years to personally develop yourself for the role that you're in and for what you want to do. One of the best pieces of advice that I've ever given to people who want to be managers is go and learn to be a manager. Go and find a way of educating yourself so that when you are in a position to interview for a manager role and someone says to you, you've not been a manager before, you can say, here's the things I've done to compensate for that. I think that can be demonstrated really easily. It's really easy for people to say, yeah, I love to be coached, but show me what that means. Show me how you've experienced that, how you've done it. What coaching sessions do you have your existing manager? Have you got a mentor? Have you sought the services of an external coach? Those types of things are absolutely crucial. Selling, I tend not to try and sell the company to people that I recruit. If I want them, I try and sell me to them and the way that I work. I think that is, because that for me is the fundamentally most important thing for them, is are they going to thrive under my organization? So I'll talk about the types of things that we've been talking about today, what makes me tick, what I'm interested in, what I like to see, and use that as a way to then get them comfortable that I'm the right person to work with. And then we can talk about the benefits that the company might deliver, whether it's the product or the benefits package or something else. But I think if you don't get that connection set up, then it's always going to be more difficult.
Yeah, I agree. And I love what you said about, even if you don't have the opportunity to manage, learn how to lead before, because that's really the best time to learn, is before you even go into the situation, because I feel like it comes at you real quick in terms of some of the things that come with management, some of the challenges, some of the conversations that you have to have. It definitely helps knowing how to navigate some of that stuff going in.
Yeah, 100%. Again, I come from a generation where typically you got asked to do a job before you got promoted into it. So you had to do it. That tends not to happen as much now. But I think that, again, the kind of assumption that good salespeople make good managers is, again, false. And it carries across lots of different sectors. Football is a good example, but a lot of the very top managers weren't particularly good football players. And actually, some of the best football players struggle to manage because they have expectations on the people that they're now managing that aren't realistic. But I think whatever role it is you want to do, part of the reason that I feel personal development planning is so important is, even if someone doesn't want to be a manager in the future, they might want to do something different. I have someone in my team at the moment who, when his last development plan review, he's a young person, he'd said he was interested in account management. So immediately it's okay, if that's where you want to go, let's talk about what you need to do to develop yourself to get ready for that role, because it's different from a new business salesperson. And if that's something you want to do in 2 or 3 years' time, we can start to not overflow you with that kind of stuff, but we can start to feed stuff in that's going to start preparing you for it, which will help you decide if it is something you want to do, but also make sure you're ready for it at the point in time when you want to do it. So I think that's really important. It's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And just as we close, if you could talk to yourself at the beginning of your career, what's some of the advice that you'd give to yourself?
Oh, that's a really good question. Maybe a little bit left field. I would have told my early self that I should spend more time in an office.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So my second sales job, and pretty much always from then until 2015, I was remote, basically, predominantly remote. There was a little bit of time when my first couple of years in London, I was in an office, and then that role changed to remote. And sometimes it was because I was the only person in the UK or the only person in EMEA, so there was no office to be in. But there are other times when there were offices. And I thought it was amazing. I loved the freedom. I loved the flexibility. I traveled a lot for most of my career in electronics. I'd be away a couple of weeks of the month to different parts of the world. And it made the travel workable because I wasn't then having to get into an office on the Friday when I landed back on the Thursday night and stuff like that. So when I decided to work for the company doing the body cameras, I remember in the last interview I had with them, the CEO said, we need you in the office every day. And I came very close to turning down the position because of that.
Wow.
Because it felt like such a big change in my life to go from being remote and in an office. But I decided I'd give it a go and see how it worked out. The office was a bit strange. It was on a boat, a bit odd.
Did you say on a boat?
Yeah, it was on a boat in Hampton Wick, across the river from Kingston. So it was actually in the river, and it was a barge that had been converted. That was it's very interesting. We had to give out seasickness tablets to new recruits if they had any issues with seasickness. It was quite bizarre. But anyway, and then the next week role was office based when I started there. And what I realised from those two roles was the collaboration, the communication, the ability to learn things from other people around about you was something that I had missed for almost 20 years, 15 years of my career. And I went from being a massive advocate for remote working to being a completely anti-remote working. It was bizarre, the shift that happened. And then the pandemic happened and everyone went to remote working and I was kind of pulling my hair out. And I genuinely believe that I believe that a hybrid working scenario is the right thing. The job I have now is predominantly remote because our office is in Scotland, but I'll go there every 2 or 3 weeks. But I stress to anyone that will listen to me that if there's an opportunity to go and meet your colleagues, even if it's in a coffee shop for an afternoon, do it. Go and spend time with people and engage. And yeah, you can do it over Teams and Zoom and Google Meet.
It's not the same.
It's never the same.
It's not the same.
So I would tell my early self that for sure. I would probably tell my early self to believe in myself a bit more, but that's just standard, right? That comes with experience. It's just everyone probably thinks that. And to have the confidence in my convictions. Come back to that comment earlier about the biggest mistake in my career. I have that belief that I know what I'm talking about. Not always, obviously. If I don't, then someone's going to tell me. But speak up rather than let things happen around about you.
I think what you said about have confidence that you do know what you're talking about, but then it comes back to what you said about coachability and being willing to hear feedback. But I think the important thing is input your thoughts into the situation because someone else might not have thought of it. It's that
exactly.
thing. Put it out there. Be open to the fact that there might be something that your leaders thought of that you've not thought of. But at least put your conversation out there or your thoughts out there because you might have something they've not thought of.
100% agree with that. Yeah, that's definitely the case. And it's not an easy environment to encourage within a workplace, I think, because you have different personalities. And I think it's something that is actually even worse over video conference because it's quite easy for people who aren't as confident or maybe introvert to speak up. I think it's incumbent on leaders and managers and other people in business, because sometimes you get de facto leaders that will appear, to try and find a way of encouraging that and getting people to do more of that. But it can be a challenge, it really can.
So we had some conversations about inclusive leadership, and we had quite a diverse group of people. And some of the ladies, they were Asian, and they were saying, look, when a guy is talking in their culture, for example, they are trained to not talk, right? So there was a guy who was like an older white guy, and you could see the things turning in his head where I thought that these guys just had nothing to say. And he's now realizing that I've got to bring them into the conversation. I've got to think of ways to be inclusive. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's on the leaders to be more inclusive, bring more people into the conversation, and not just wait for the loudest voice to rise to the top.
Yeah, 100%. I had a manager, a CEO of a business actually, who, when I first started in the role, gave me a book called When Cultures Collide. And it simply was a book. It was quite a thick book, and it basically had a chapter on every country in the world and talked about their culture.
Wow.
And he said, you're going to travel a lot with this role. You're going to find this book invaluable in terms of understanding the kind of people that you're going to meet when you go in. And it's exactly that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
I did a lot of business, and I went to Japan a lot, and you learn that people just say yes to everything in Japan. but it doesn't mean yes. So when people travel for business or are selling internationally, it's really important for them to think about how, again, going back to that point, how does the audience react, or what does the audience need from you? You've got to be empathetic to that. And empathy is something that I've found quite difficult, and especially when I was a salesperson rather than a sales manager. I think the biggest change I had to make to me was learning to be more empathetic as I became more of a leader. But even within your own organization and the people that you work with, you've got to try and think about how their culture might impact them. My partner's from a different culture, and I've got to learn things like, in her culture, even if someone says to you at a dinner table, go ahead and eat when there are other people haven't got their plates, they don't mean that.
Yeah.
You're supposed to wait until everyone's got dinner. But that's completely alien to me, because in Scotland, people just eat as soon as they've got food, because we don't want anyone else to steal it, basically. So that learn those, and I've got someone in my team now who's from a similar culture, and she does exactly the same. If we're out for the team dinner, she'll wait until everyone else has got their food. Right. Those are really subtle things that you have to try and pick up on as quickly as you can, both in terms of the teams that you're managing and your
so
workplace, but then also with the people that you're dealing with externally.
Chris, thank you so much for your time, for your thoughts, for your vulnerability, even where things didn't go so well. So I really appreciate your time, and I know that everyone that's listening will have appreciated it too. So thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure too. And we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you guys so much for listening to the episode. We really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend some time with us to hear about the journeys of sales leaders and learn how you can become a better leader at what you do.
Absolutely. There's a huge amount of value in listening to someone else's story. And what we're really aiming to do with every one of these episodes is introduce you to someone that you might never have met, but that's got some great lessons as part of their own journey that you can take an inspiration from. And whether that's things that you've liked that you want to try and replicate, big decisions that they've taken that give you a bit of courage to go and take that leap yourself, or maybe some things that they've learned the hard way that you can avoid to basically find your own path a bit faster with some of the less messy stuff in between. So we really appreciate your time. We do this every week with a different leader within technology. So please go back and have a look through some of the other conversations that we've had to find other people that might inspire you, that you can bring into your own network as virtual mentors. And also every week we release this. So if you want to be the first person to listen and meet your new mentor, hit the subscribe button, and then you'll get a notification every time that podcast gets released. So thank you so much for your time. We'll see you on the next pod.